Hello, American history students. Okay, since we're having trouble with Blackboard, I'm just going to make this recording for you, and you can use this to get the same information that we were going to get in class today. So you do need to do 3.02 and 3.03 readings. You don't have assignments for those. 3.04 is a reading that's due tomorrow. Mrs. Ide will be here with you tomorrow, so if there is something that you need to talk with me about, please do so today. I do have a fun activity planned for you with her, so hopefully you'll be able to do that. Some terms that we will talk about today: Nat Turner, Denmark Vesey, slavery, slave rebellions, sabotage, and Christianity. So by this point in history, slavery had become very entrenched in American society, especially in the South. Large-scale plantations producing goods such as cotton needed large workforces to keep up with demand. Another big one, especially early in the country, was tobacco. But just because it was common doesn't mean that everyone agreed with it. It also doesn't mean that the slaves just took it and didn't try to remedy the situation. So while large-scale slave revolts weren't especially common, there were some that really left their mark on Southern society. So today we're going to be learning about slavery in the United States and a little bit about some of the rebellious activities that people would do to try and get back at their slave owners. So views on slavery. Slavery was very, very common in the South. It was, for Southern society, it was just part of how life worked for them. Um, and people were so used to it, they didn't really even see it anymore. It was the way things were. Their economy was based on agriculture and cash crops. So cash crops meaning not things that you would just make for yourself, but things that you would make and sell that can make you a ton of money. Okay, so like cotton was a big one. Especially with the creation of the cotton gin, which I have a picture of on the board for you, that was invented by Eli Whitney. And it made it to where you could get the seeds out of cotton really quickly just by turning that crank that's on there. And it made cotton really, really productive. So with that and a combination of the Industrial Revolution, where we have all kinds of textile mills happening, where people are making a lot of money on making fabrics, that kind of entrenched slavery even more so in the South. Okay, it made it even more important to them because this was really, really manual labor. So uh, the bigger that these textiles got, with the cotton gin here and everything, it entrenched the slavery in the South even further. And slavery for them, a lot of people considered it to be a way of life, that's the way things were. So how do people feel in the North? Slavery happened in the North and the South at first. It happened in both of them. Some people don't know that there were actually slaves in the North as well. However, it was slowly phased out in the North, with the North passing legislation to outlaw it, and they were doing it like by state by state. But the South was actually doing the opposite. They started making laws that actually protected slavery and made sure that it would have a place in their society. Now, I want you to take a second and think about this. Why do you think the North and the South had such different views on slavery? Slavery in the South was getting even more and more important, I guess, to them. They were getting deeper and deeper into this slavery society. The number of slaves was getting larger and larger. By 1860, they made up about half of the population of many southern states. So there was about as many um, slaves in the states as there were freed folk. Okay, so and these people were completely dependent on their masters for everything. That's what slavery was about, where you couldn't, get even a lot of the things that so you would think a person should be able to do for themselves, should be able to get for themselves. They had to get that from their slave masters. So these owners had ultimate control over somebody's lives. If you can imagine that, not just like parents having control over what you do or where you go, but every little thing, everything. That is what it was like. So slaves were clothed and fed by their masters, whether you wanted to get new clothing, what you wanted to eat, whether you could get married, you know, uh, where you're going to live, what you're going to do each day for the rest of your life. All of those things were decided by someone other than you if you were a slave. The importation of slaves was banned in the early 1800s, so what some people did is because you couldn't keep getting more slaves, they thought of these slaves as property and kind of wanting to keep their property healthy. I know it's a really weird way to think about it, but people thought of slaves as like an investment, um, and you wanted to take care of them. However, you didn't. While I say that they wanted to take care of them, I mean take care of them as you would, any other piece of property that you have. You don't treat property the same way as you treat your husband or your wife or your family, right? So I don't mean that they were treated well because they weren't. Um, it's very hard for us today to think about people treating other people this way, um, but that's how a lot of people felt about it. So, and they could also be sold at any time for any reason. Any reason at all. Someone could just sell you. Could you imagine that? I mean, being with your family and you could have a husband or a wife and you could have your children there, you could have your family there, and at any time you could just be sold off. That'd be terrible. What do you think about this question? How did slave owners punish their slaves? Most slaves tended cotton fields, so that was the really big cash crop of this time, cotton. Some of them were house servants, so they were brought inside and serving as servants to the people right within the home, right on the plantation, the slave owners. Slaves could get married, but it wasn't legal. Okay, it's not like they had a legal document. They were married in the eyes of the church, though. They had families, they built communities, and they practiced Christianity. And Christianity was very much so encouraged, as well as encouraged to have a lot of families. Now, why do you think that is? Why would a slave owner want their slaves to get married? Why would they want them to have families like that? So here's a little review activity. I want you to go through the word bank at the bottom, think through these, see if you can find the answers. Slavery was common in the early colonies in both the where and the where, the North and the South. As time went on, the North started passing laws that did what to slavery? Outlawed it. The South, on the other hand, passed laws that did what? Protected slavery. The slave master had ultimate control over a slave's life and can enforce many punishments like whippings. Slaves were considered an investment and could be kept, so they would be kept, sorry. Usually they try and keep people healthy so that they could keep those investments. However, they were still property to the slave owners. Slaves could get what and have what? They could get married and they could have families, but they could also be They could also be sold at the whim of their masters. A little bit about resistance. Most slaves learned to accept their slavery and became resigned. So, if you think about why someone might do that, you could just think about anyone you have in your life who might, have a job they don't like, but they're just kind of resigned to it. Or maybe someone you know that has a boyfriend or girlfriend that treats them wrong, but they just kind of accept it. Sometimes people do that type of thing, and it's that kind of attitude that some people had as slavery because this is what their whole life was like, and they just thought, that's the way it was. I mean, it wasn't right and it wasn't good, but that's the way that it was. That was the hand that they were dealt. But not everybody got resigned that way. There was a lot of people still that were pushing and that were fighting and were trying to do things, even if they were just little, to try and stop what was happening. So, slaves did try to get back at their masters through things like sabotage. So, they might deliberately ruin something, perhaps it's equipment, perhaps it's property, whatever it is, to get back at their masters for how they're being treated. They also would do work slowdowns to hurt profits. Okay, so if they know that their master's going to make a lot of money and needed all this stuff done right away, perhaps they'd work slow that day on purpose to get back at them, or to make it look like all slaves are pulling their weight. So, for example, perhaps if we had some more elderly slaves and they weren't doing so well and they were having a hard time keeping up, everybody would slow down so it would look like they were all working at the same place or at the same pace. Sometimes they would abuse tools, break things, perhaps even set a barn on fire. You get the idea there. Do things to try and get back at their masters, okay? All right. So, escaping slavery, a common form of rebellion was running away. A lot of people were caught and returned, though. So, some people might have just been trying to visit family members because we know that people get sold to other plantations. So, they might have not really been running away, but trying to go visit, and then come back. But some were focused on going to northern cities. So, what is the most famous way that slaves took to make it to freedom in the north? There were slave rebellions. There were a few that were very large or a few that were very successful, but there were a couple. So the most famous one was the captives of the Spanish ship La Amistad. They actually, well, the Spanish ship is a slave ship, and they were going to go sell these people as slaves. And they actually had a slave revolt on the ship, were able to take over the ship, and eventually, this took a little while, but eventually they were able to gain their freedom and get passage back to Africa. So that was pretty cool. We also have the case of Denmark Vesey, and he was a preacher in Charleston, and he had a plot to try and overthrow Charleston there. And also Nat Turner. Nat Turner, he was the leader of the biggest slave rebellion ever in the United States. It went on for days. There were hundreds of people involved, and a lot of people were killed. It really really scared Southern society. Not enough to actually make them end slavery, but this really really got people's attention with Nat Turner. So take a few minutes, see if you can figure this out. The importation of slaves was what in the early 1800s? Some slaves used this as a way to get back at their masters. What fits here? Slavery was deeply entrenched in this part of the United States. This is the guy that led a slave revolt that was the largest in American history. He was a preacher whose plot to overthrow Charleston was discovered, and many slaves practiced this religion. Okay, slavery was a part of the United States since the days of colonization. As time moved on, it was banned in the North, but became more important for the South. Slaves had a really hard life. They were completely controlled, but they did things like small rebellious acts. People ran away. They did acts of sabotage. Some even turned to outright rebellion. So it's not that people just took it. Okay. There were a lot of people who were fighting from the very beginning. So while it did not end slavery, it certainly highlighted that there was something wrong with this institution. All right, let me know if you have questions, guys.